everyone. Welcome to another episode of JewishDrinking.com, the show, podcast, video, and I'm Rabbi Drew Kaplan, your host. And today we have Professor Caryn Tamber-Rosenau. I pronounced that right?
Yep.
Awesome. So we're talking today about Judith, the Book of Judith, because as I mentioned in last week's podcast / video episode with Rabbi Ben Schefter about Hanukkah and drinking on Hanukkah, Rabbi Isserlis in his comments to the Shulchan Aruch mentions that we have some practices associated with Judith. So today I brought on Professor Tamber-Rosenau to discuss the Book of Judith. And before she does, let me just quickly do a little bio of her. She presently is an instructional assistant professor at the University of Houston. Go Tigers! And Cougars, yeah.
Yes.
And her background before she got to Houston is that she got her BA in communications with a minor in women's studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And then she got her MA in Jewish studies from Baltimore Hebrew Institute. Interesting, I've never heard of it. And then she got to crown it all off, she got her PhD from Vanderbilt University, so she's got a lot of time in the South. Before she was a biblical scholar, she was a newspaper reporter. Did I get all that right?
Yep.
Okay, and the most important part of all of this, of course, is to sell products. So Professor Tamber-Rosenau's 2018 book, which is a reworked version of her dissertation, is called Women in Drag, Gender and Performance in the Hebrew Bible and Early Jewish Literature. So you can pick up a copy. I'm going to put a link down below in the YouTube description and on the page so you can buy it. So we're talking about Book of Judith.
Yes.
Right? And so Professor Tamber-Rosenau, you've discussed a lot in your dissertation and obviously in your 2018 book that people can buy about the Book of Judith. So I'm just going to start off, since I imagine most people have never heard of the Book of Judith. So what is it? What is the Book of Judith?
So Judith is a book that is in the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is a collection of texts written by Jews for Jews in an ancient Jewish context. But unlike the books of the Tanakh, the books of the Apocrypha didn't make it into the ultimate version of the Jewish canon. But they were read and they were circulated. In particular, they were circulated in ancient Judaism along with the Septuagint, which is an early Greek translation of the Tanakh, so translation from Hebrew into Greek. So in addition to the books of the Tanakh, your book of Genesis, your book of Judges, your books of Samuel, all the books that we know and love, we had all these books of the Apocrypha, these other Jewish books that were circulating in Greek in ancient Jewish communities. Ultimately, when the canon was sort of finalized and when the Hebrew version took priority in ancient Judaism, these books of the Apocrypha didn't make it in. They just kind of got voted off the island. However, when Christians adopted the Jewish scriptures into their Bible, they also adopted these apocryphal Jewish texts. So in addition to the Book of Judith, some other things that your listeners might have heard of, very appropriate to this time of year, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the books that tell about the Maccabean revolt and the Seleucid tyranny and all this whole rigmarole. Those are books of the Apocrypha too. They're not in the Tanakh, but they are in the Apocrypha. The Wisdom of Ben Sira, the Book of Tobit, all these books that I like to sometimes call them a shadow Bible, because they're books that were circulated in parallel, but didn't make it into our canon in Judaism. So that's where Judith falls.
That's a cool term, a shadow Bible. That's good. I like it. What's been the reception history of the Book of Judith? So aside from it being part of the shadow Bible, how well has it been known, whether in Jewish or non-Jewish contexts?
So historically, there's always been a lot more engagement with it in Christian circles than in Jewish circles because it was kind of on the margins of the canon. So there was always a lot of, the church fathers in late antiquity do write about Judith and they do talk about her. The rabbis, they don't. They really don't talk about her at all. She just kind of the Book of Judith just fell out of Jewish discussion for hundreds of years. Ultimately, we do see a reemergence of discussion about the Book of Judith in the Middle Ages, where people start writing midrashic treatments of the book. But there's just, she doesn't really appear in the Talmud. She doesn't appear in Josephus, like any of our usual suspects of ancient Jewish sources. She just, there's just not much on her.
So how does that get picked up in the Middle Ages? Where does it come from that they start treating it, and are they working with the text that was from the Second Temple era? Are they coming up with some sort of oral traditions and reworking it? What are the mechanics of all that?
So the person who I know of who's done the most work on this is a scholar named Deborah Levine-Guerra. So I'm going to refer to her work here. She's done a lot of work on the medieval Judith traditions, and what she says is that you've got a really changed text that emerges in the Middle Ages. It's a really different story. So this is where we actually come up with things like Judith as related to Hanukkah. There's nothing in the original Book of Judith that relates her to the Maccabees. The Maccabees are not mentioned, although you can maybe find some allusions to them if you're looking. But this connection of her to Hanukkah comes up in the Middle Ages. Additionally, we start seeing some rewriting of, well, is she a pious widow like she is in the original book, or is she, a young virgin or something? We start seeing connections to her as possibly being a relative of the Maccabees, a sister or an aunt to Judah Maccabee. All these things, and the tradition about Judith plying Holofernes with cheese, which people talk about a lot associated with Hanukkah, that comes up in the Middle Ages too. That's not actually in the original text of Judith. So the role that Judith takes and the text, it's pretty different. They just some of the medieval writers just take it and run in a real different direction.
Fascinating, because it, impacts Jewish practice of having cheesy, goodness, cheesy cuisine.
Yeah. Which, why fight it if there's a holiday that says you need to eat fried things and also add some cheese? I'm not gonna take issue with that, but connecting it to Judith, it really is a medieval tradition and not actually going back to the Book of Judith from antiquity.
Yeah. When was it written about?
So most scholars date Judith to the second half of the 2nd century BCE. So that's the 100s. So around about 160, 180, somewhere in there. And some people actually would date it to closer to the year 100, so even later in time. There's even a minority of scholars who would put it somewhere in the first half of the 1st century BCE.
So it's post-Maccabean revolt.
Yeah, possibly around the time, maybe a little bit after. Yeah, it's roughly contiguous in time. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, so let's get down to the text, which is what we're here to talk about, which is wine in the Book of Judith. Sure. And wine plays no small role in the story.
Yep, it's kind of a key to the plot. Yep.
Yeah, it is the key. It is the primary key.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those who, I imagine a lot of people listening or watching this are not necessarily going to go out and run to pick up a book and read chapters 12 and 13 and see what all the wine conversation is about. So can I ask you for a quick summary leading up to chapters 12 and 13?
Sure. Okay. So in the Book of Judith, we have a battle, a war on. We've got a character called Holofernes, and he is a general of the Assyrians. And at the command of the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who in reality, in actual historical reality, is a king of the Babylonians and not the Assyrians. The whole book is just crawling with anachronisms, and we can talk about that too if you like. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, is trying to conquer the Levant, the region where, bordering the Mediterranean, where today you can find Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, etc. And so they are trying to conquer the Levant. And some of the people there just roll over and acquiesce and say, all right, we surrender. But the people of Israel don't. And they are trying to resist. And so Holofernes lays siege to them. And they are still resisting. And so Holofernes, there's a guy who comes to Holofernes, and this guy's name is Achior. He is a member of the people of Ammon. He's an Ammonite. And Achior says to Holofernes, let me explain to you about these people. The people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and then their God took them out, and they're very favored. And they have this whole story. And here's the thing. You will never be able to conquer this people as long as their God is with them. And their God will be with them as long as they're righteous. So as long as they don't sin, they are invincible, and you will never be able to conquer them. And Holofernes says, I don't like this answer. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to besiege them anyway. And Achior, you, the messenger of bad news, if you like the Israelites so much, you can hang out with them. He tosses Achior into one of the cities of Israel called Bethulia. We can talk more about that too, because that is a very loaded word.
Why don't you mention it now?
Sure.
Okay.
Why not? Yeah. Okay. So Bethulia, for Hebrew speakers among your listeners, is suspiciously close to the Hebrew word Betula version. I'm not the only scholar who has pointed out. First of all, we know of no actual historical ancient city of Bethulia. So it seems that it was possibly made up for the story. And it is, as I tell my students, this is a town that is trying to fend off the advances of a rapacious army. And it is basically it is Virgin Town. It is the town of Virgin.
It doesn't want to be penetrated by the Assyrians.
Precisely. It's a metaphor, like so many things in the Book of Judith, including Judith herself, whose name means Jewess. So we've got this siege going on. Achior is sent into the town of Bethulia.
Not just Jewess, but also specifically like the female version of Yehuda, who's one of the primary protagonists of Maccabees.
Right. So Achior is tossed into Bethulia. Bethulia is besieged, and things are going really badly for them because the whole point of a siege is to starve people out. Starve them out, make them die of hunger and thirst, or get them that close to that, and they'll just surrender to you. That's the whole point. You don't have to go in, you just wait them out. So the people of Bethulia, people are dying in the streets, kids are dying of thirst. It's pretty ugly. The male leaders of the town say, we have to think about surrendering. We're going to give God 5 days. And if God doesn't make good on saving us in 5 days, then we need to surrender because, our children are dying in the streets. This is horrible. So here we get Judith. This has been 7 chapters, by the way. 7 chapters, no Judith. It's the Book of Judith. We haven't met her yet. Chapter 8, we finally meet Judith. Judith is introduced, by the way, by this lavish genealogy. She's got a 16-generation genealogy, which is extensive. Like this is like a kind of genealogy you usually see for like a male priest or something like that. But they establish her bona fides. How far back does she go? She is.
And you know what's funny? The second line in the 8th chapter mentions her husband, not even her husband's father. Just like, that's his name. We have
The genealogy is Judith's. It does not belong to her husband. He really doesn't matter. And in fact, he dies in they talk about him dying really early in that chapter. So we hear about Judith. We hear about her husband, Menashe, who was apparently died of heat stroke. He was working, he died, and Judith's been a widow for 3 years and change. She's beautiful, she's wealthy, she's pious, and she lives in a very ascetic fashion, befitting her widowhood. So because she is a widow, even though it's been a bit, she really plays up the widow thing. She is dressing in widow's clothing still. She wears sackcloth. Her beautiful clothing that she used to wear when her husband was alive sits in a closet somewhere, we can presume, because she is just wearing, widow's sackcloth. She fasts more often than she doesn't, which I feel bad for her. That sounds awful. She fasts on all the days except for the Sabbath and the day leading up to the Sabbath, and the festivals and the day leading up to the festivals, and the day of the new moon and the day leading up to the new moon. So she's probably very hungry. And my favorite detail about Judith's asceticism as a widow is that she has this beautiful house, but she lives in a tent on the roof of her house, as a sign of her mourning. So enter Judith. So we have Judith. And Judith's reaction to the male leaders of Bethulia saying, hey, we have to surrender, is, how dare you? She calls them to her house and they come. She summons them and they come to her, which I think shows how much power she has, how much respect she has in the town. And she says to them, how dare you put God on a timeline? You can't do that. You think you're putting yourself in the place of God. And she says, I have a plan. Don't ask me what it is. I'm not going to tell you, but I have a plan, and this is going to solve everything for us. And all you have to do is, I'm going to come to the city gates tonight, open the city gates and let me out. And they don't ask. They just say, okay, sure. And they're kind of dismissive of her. They say, oh, why don't you just go pray? And she's like, no, really, I have a plan. And they're like, all right, whatever, Judith. Okay, it's fine. So Judith then gets all dolled up. They are under water restriction, apparently, because they're being starved out. They have no water. People are dying of thirst, but nonetheless, she takes a nice bath. She anoints herself. She puts on her beautiful clothes that she used to wear when her husband was alive. She puts on all of the jewelry that she owns. She puts on a tiara or turban, something in her hair to, something royal. And she packs up a bunch of kosher food, because you gotta have the food if you're going out of town. Takes her maidservant, and that night she goes.
Wait.
Yes.
She doesn't just take food.
And wine. And
wine. Yes. And oil.
And the
wine and oil also.
Yes.
Can't forget the wine.
You're right. I forgot who I'm talking to. So she takes wine, right? And she takes her maidservant, and that night they go out of the gates of the village. And the men of the village, the town leaders, see her, and they are awestruck by how beautiful she is. She's beautiful before, but now she's all dolled up, and she is just ravishing, and they are astounded. So she and her maid, with all their stuff, walk from Bethulia into the Assyrian camp. And all the men in the Assyrian camp are also just awestruck by their beauty. You can kind of just imagine them with their jaws hanging toward the ground, and they're just drooling, right? They are awestruck by her, and a phalanx of 100 men accompanies her to the tent of the general Holofernes. She gets to the tent of Holofernes, and she says to him, I'm defecting because my people are so hungry in Bethulia that they are about to eat the sacrificial food, the food that's only supposed to be sacrificed to God. They're going to eat it. And when they do that, that's a sin. And when they sin, God will say to them, God will destroy them because they have transgressed. And I don't want to be there when it happens. I want to help you be the instrument of their destruction. You follow me, and I will tell you exactly how to defeat them. I will lead you in a triumphal procession.
Right, which was helped set up by Achior earlier on in the book, before Judas is even on the scene.
Exactly.
That there's an outlet for him to win, which is the potential for sinning. And once she says that, it's like a trigger for him, like, oh, it's an opportunity.
Right. It's foreshadowing. She's also dropping double entendres all over the place, both sexual and she is speaking double in that she keeps referring to whatever my Lord wants, I will do. And she's talking about God. And Holofernes thinks she's talking about him. So she is very wise. She's speaking in this very crafty fashion, and he completely falls for it, hook, line, and sinker. He says, never has a woman been so beautiful or spoken so wisely. I will do whatever you say that I should do. Let's do this. You're free to stay in the camp. Yeah. So she stays in the camp for 3 days, and she has the food, she has the wine. Holofernes says to her at the beginning, what will we do if we run out of your provisions before it's time to attack. And she says, nope, don't worry about it. It won't happen. We'll have more than enough for the time that I'm going to be here. So on the third day that she's been in the camp, and he's just getting very excited by her presence. He really wants her. So he says, and it's worded so weirdly. Holofernes says, if I do not try to have sex with her, she will laugh at me.
Also, I mean, it's also very strange that why does it take 3 days? Why not that night? Like, there is something weird about Holofernes that you would expect him to take the opportunity when he has it, rather than saying,
Yeah.
it's not a priority. I'm more interested in trying to, penetrate this town, which we're not making any movement on, and I'd rather wait days to try to penetrate her. Like, it's just it's almost like, yeah, it's very strange. He's not as potent as you would expect him to want to be.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, you would expect that he moves right away, maybe, but he doesn't. And for the sake of the plot, right? So Judith instead is trying to kind of increase his interest over the course of days. And so she is, she only appears at night, and then she's taking a bath. And I argue in an article that she's bathing probably in the camp or within sight of the camp as a kind of, hey, look, boys, I'm over here taking a bath. She's wanting him to get very excited that he wants her. He hasn't had her yet. So on the third day, he finally says, all right, I need to try to sleep with her, or she will laugh at me. He sends a servant to invite her to a drinking party. It's very clear that this is supposed to be, drinking and sex to follow. And she says, nothing would please me more. So she goes. She has her maidservant lay down a nice plush rug for her to recline on. She goes, and out comes the wine. And he drinks to excess. He just keeps drinking and drinking and drinking. And the text says, yeah.
I'm going to pause you there because at the very end of chapter 12, Judas says, I'm going to drink because my life has magnified in me this day more than all days since I was ever born. Like, yes. I'm really excited to drink too.
Yes,
but then,
so she's drinking too.
And she drinks, but then he goes, he has a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, they're both drinking. That's right. And we don't know whether it says, it's not that she's pretending to drink. The text says that she ate and drank before him. But he is going a little wild with the drinking. It says that he drank much more than he had ever had in any day since he was born. So, he's so excited about Judith that he drinks way too much.
And he dismisses everybody else from his tent. So it's just the two of them. Two of them are alone with each other. She's had some wine. He's had way, 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 way lots of wine.
Yes.
And he's lying on the bed.
Yes. He is lying on the bed and he is passed out. I mean, he is gone. And she strikes. It's just Holofernes and Judith alone in the tent. He is a general, so he has a sword above his bed. She reaches for the sword, and she hacks his head off with the sword while he is dead drunk. Yeah. She rolls his body off the bed and places the head in the bag that she had been carrying her food in, hands the head to her maidservant, and the two of them leave the camp, and nobody stops them because they've been going in and out of the camp the whole time. Nobody stops them. They leave the camp, and nobody wants to interrupt Holofernes because they think he's had a great night. So they just let him sleep in until they're like, they start to get a little concerned in the morning. They come in, they find his headless body. Judith, meanwhile, has gone back to Bethulia and said to the men of the town, hang this head on the city wall. They hang the head on the wall, so when the guys in the Assyrian camp see the headless body, then they look up at the wall of the city of Bethulia and they see his head hanging there, and they're terrified. And they are scattered and are just flee in horror. And Judith and the people of Bethulia and the people of Israel are saved.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back, and obviously this is Jewish drinking, so I'm going to emphasize the role of the wine because, it's interesting. Without the wine and without Holofernes being drunk, Judith still could have accomplished her mission, but she would not have done it unpenetrated, let's just say. Like maybe, let's say there's no wine, and Holofernes has his way with Judith, and then he's asleep. She still could have cut his head off because it's just her and him in the tent, cut his head off, gone back, stuck his head on the battlements, and, achieved the exact same, it would have been her personal sacrifice for Bethulia, but they still, like, the mission still would have been accomplished, right? But the role of the wine allows her not only to accomplish her mission, but also to escape unpenetrated, just like the virgin town next door.
This is true, although the story of Judith does rely a great deal on the story of Yael and Sisera in
Yes.
Judges 4 and 5. And in that one, there is no wine, and Yael manages to kind of lull Sisera to sleep after feeding him milk or curds. And he is, at least in the prose version of the story in Judges 4, he is sleeping, and she, stabs him through the temple with a tent peg. So there is precedent for, and it's never said that they that he has sex with her in that story. So it is certainly possible to envision something else. If we are looking at Yael, where Judith escapes with her chastity intact. But I take your point absolutely that that she manages.
I wouldn't say chastity. She just maybe postmarital chastity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say chastity rather than virginity, because chastity meaning her sexual continence, right? Because she is chaste. She is, the book is really clear that after her widowhood, that she is forever chaste after that. She has not been with another man. And after she returns to Bethulia, after she's a heroine, many men propose marriage to her, and she refuses all of them and dies in her chaste widow status. So she's a chaste widow, and I make the argument in my book that, like, she never intends to be anything other than that. She is not on the market sexually. She doesn't want to get married. She doesn't want to have sex. Like, she wants to be that chaste widow figure.
Yeah.
So she is able to escape with her chastity or her sexual continence intact. And the book makes a big deal of that. When Judith goes back to Bethulia, she says, "I swear to you that it was the beauty of my face that seduced him. I was not dishonored." She is real specific about, like, it was my looks, but we never went all the way.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
It's 16,
It's in
13,
13.
16.
It's in
Yeah.
13. As the Lord lives, who has protected me in the way I went, I swear that it was my face that seduced him to his destruction, and that he committed no sin with me to defile and shame me. Yeah. So she's real clear on, I am unsullied. We never went all the way.
The wine it plays an important role in maintaining her. I like your sexual continence phrasing, which is, but she still could have accomplished it without it. It just helped her accomplish. It was like the best way of accomplishing her mission. Also,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Plus, it also makes him way more vulnerable than had he not drunk wine.
Oh yeah, because he is. The question is, how is this woman? And presumably, she is not the strongest woman in the world, because she keeps fasting, right? Like, how does this poor thing have the strength to lift the sword? How does this woman, take down not just any man, but a general? Right? How does she have the strength to do this? She's not going to best him in hand-to-hand combat. She has to use the tools of her femininity to get him in a position where he gets himself so besotted with wine that he is vulnerable, that she is able to literally stand over him and take what she wants, which is his head. And there's of course, there's a sexual assault metaphor there as well.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I'm going to switch gears here of the practice that we have nowadays with eating dairy products and eating cheesy stuff. And it's funny because some of the earlier medieval scholars say, well, it's this Judith, and that she used the cheesy dish to get him thirsty to then drink wine. And through the
Yes.
drink, he got drunk, she chopped his head off and took it to whatever. And so it's fascinating because no one talks about the importance of wine. There's just the cheese, the dairy consumption. But the
Yeah.
wine plays an important role in that,
Yeah.
consumptively.
Yeah. So maybe Hanukkah should be like another Purim, where we should be, it should be minchag to consume wine.
Right. Right. It's just funny that wine it plays a central role, yet we don't care about it. It's the dairy that we care about.
It's
Although
true.
it should be pointed out that in the Book of Judith, dairy it doesn't even appear.
No, not
There's
at all.
nothing there.
Not at all. But again, if cheesy goodness is going to happen on Hanukkah, if that's your custom, more power to you. But yeah, it is really interesting. The wine certainly is important as something that renders him more vulnerable to being taken down by this woman. Yeah. One thing I did want to add that I had kind of made notes on before, and we'd kind of alluded to before, is the anachronisms in the book. It doesn't specifically deal with the wine, but I just think it's really interesting. So I mentioned before that Judith's name is a symbol. The town of Bethulia, that name is a symbol. We also have other things in the text that point to this not being a historical story, not being historically based on something that happened. First of all, we have no information from any historical records about this being something that actually happened in history, in real history. We also have several cues that the ancient audience would have seen this not as a historically based text. So the very beginning of Judith, before we even meet Judith, it says, "It was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh." So it puts the story in time, but anybody who knows anything about ancient history knows that Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylonian, not an Assyrian, and that the town of Nineveh the city of Nineveh had fallen before Nebuchadnezzar. It fell when the Assyrians fell. So it's like, there have been people who've made the analogy that it's like saying, when President Macron ruled over the Guatemalans in their capital of Pretoria. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And that to us would, if we read a story that started like that, we would say, oh, this is fiction. This is playing with some historical details, but it's fiction. And there's so many details like that in the Book of Judith. So I really think an ancient audience would have seen this as fictional, which, wherever you are on the Jewish spectrum, that's usually not a problem for Jews to hear because it's not canon. It's not authoritative. For groups that do esteem the Book of Judith as part of their Bible, today that would be Eastern Orthodox Christians and Catholics. That might be a little bit more difficult. But the story of Judith is, I really argue that it is not intended to be historical. So we can just appreciate it as this great literary creation where there are these literary devices that are introduced, like the foreshadowing with Achior, or the crucial nature of the wine to the plot. It's actually, the wine in the plot is so strange because this seems like the strangest plan that Judith would make, because it relies on everything going exactly as planned, including Holofernes getting so drunk he passes out. What if he'd gotten drunk and it made him more aggressive and belligerent, and now she had to fight him off? This is a very strange plan. But if we free the text from considering it as history and just go with, this is a really cool piece of literature, okay. We can buy it. We don't have to really suspend our disbelief. We can say this is a really neat text where wine plays this really crucial role, and it's kind of a deus ex machina that Holofernes gets so drunk that he passes out.
I mean, she obviously helped. She
Yes.
must have, through flirtatiousness, somehow encouraged him to keep drinking. And kept his interest. Otherwise, if she ran out of words, he might have made a move.
Yeah. But she's very fortuitous that he is, he drinks so much and that he is a sleepy drunk and not a mean, aggressive drunk.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Tamber-Rosenau, for this enlightening conversation on wine in the Book of Judith. I hope the rest of your holiday of Hanukkah goes well, and I hope everybody out there, you out there, enjoys the rest of your Hanukkah as well. And as always, l'chaim.